Chapter 4, Carbohydrates. I could lecture on this material in Chapter 4 for hours. There is so much material here, and a lot of it's confusing. This is where we start to get into physiology and biochemistry, which is really what nutrition is all about. But to save you all from the boredom of a 3-hour lecture, I'm going to only cover a few difficult areas. I think everything else is explained well in the notes. For starters, I want to make sure that everybody understands that grains, as well as fruits and vegetables, are carbohydrates. Many people don't realize that you can obtain a substantial amount of carbohydrates from fruits and vegetables alone, without ever eating a piece of bread. Also, it's important to realize that complex carbohydrates are starch, glycogen, and fiber. We take in starch and fiber. The recommendation used to be, eat complex carbohydrates. But this could mean eating all starch. So the new recommendation is to focus on eating whole grains. A whole grain means all of the grain, the bran, the endosperm, and the germ. Looking at the diagram here, also on page 110 in your book, you see a diagram of a kernel of wheat. The husk is removed. This is not edible. This leaves the rest of the grain. Products made with whole grains contain the entire kernel. The bran has the fiber and the germ has the vitamins and minerals. The endosperm is mostly starch with a little protein. A refined grain takes off the bran, removes the germ, and that leaves the endosperm, which is mostly starch. This gives us fluffy white rice and fluffy white bread. By law, though, the government has required manufacturers to put back in some of the nutrients it's removed. This is called enriched. Adding even more nutrients is called fortified, but the difference between the two is not important. Find the diagram on, I believe, page 7 in your lecture notes for Chapter 4 describing what happens when you eat a bagel. I'm going to go through this step by step since I know that it's confusing. Let's say you're going to eat a bagel, a nice, refined bagel with little fiber and few other nutrients. This means the bagel is mostly starch. When you start to eat the bagel, the starch immediately starts to break down in your mouth. By the time it reaches your stomach, the starch has already been broken down into strings of glucose. But starch digestion comes to a halt in your stomach. Digestion continues in the small intestines. Strings of glucose are broken down to maltose, and maltose is broken down into glucose. Glucose is then absorbed from the small intestines into the bloodstream. When eating a refined carbohydrate, like this bagel I described, the breakdown into glucose happens very quickly. This causes a rapid influx of glucose into the bloodstream. Now, if you are eating a whole grain bagel, one with fiber and protein, the fiber and protein would slow the digestive process down because the fiber is not digested or absorbed and the protein takes more time to break down. So, there would be a slower influx of glucose into the bloodstream. When the blood glucose rises, the pancreas responds by secreting the hormone insulin into the bloodstream. Insulin then transports the glucose from the bloodstream into the liver. Insulin also transports the glucose into the muscle cells as well. The liver and the muscles store glucose in the form of glycogen. This is represented by the chain of 4 glucoses linked together in the diagram. Now, if you had eaten one of those big, fluffy 800-calorie bagels, you most likely exceeded the amount of glucose that your muscles needed and that your liver could store. So once the glycogen stores are full, the remaining glucose is packaged up as a triglyceride and sent to the fat cell to be stored as fat. Now turn the page in your lecture notes to the next diagram, which is seen here. Let's take the opposite approach. What happens if you didn't eat anything? Let's say you skipped breakfast. You got up, ran off to school, now it's almost lunchtime. You have no carbohydrate intake. Your body needs fuel. How can you make it to lunch without collapsing? Well, your blood glucose has decreased. Lucky for us, our body has mechanisms to moderate both high and low blood sugars. Your pancreas responds to low blood sugar by releasing glucagon. No, not glycogen, glucagon. The glucagon then travels through the bloodstream to the liver. It acts on the liver by stimulating the breakdown of glycogen. Glycogen breaks down into glucose, and glucose is released into the bloodstream. This increases blood glucose. Remember, what we started with was low blood glucose, which means no energy to function, no energy to feed the brain. The body responded, even when we didn't eat, by breaking down our stores of glycogen into glucose to get the blood glucose level back up. Now, let's get back to that Starbucks Frappuccino. The average person on a 2,000 calorie diet shouldn't exceed 50 grams of added sugar a day. This doesn't include sugar from milk or fruits. This Frappuccino has 69 grams of total sugar. That's almost 300 calories of just sugar, and 45 grams of added sugar, almost an entire day's worth.